Hello and welcome. I am Charlotte Youngs, a real estate solicitor from Macfarlane's and a member of the CPA NextGen committee who have organised this webinar today. On behalf of the NextGen committee, I would like to thank our programme sponsors, Gardner and Theobald, for supporting our activities this year. We had originally attended this seminar to coincide with COP26, the UN climate change conference that was scheduled to take place in Glasgow in November. However, owing to the current situation, it has been postponed to next year. But fortunately, the sustainability focus has been unwavering here in London, with the City of London Corporation adopting its evidence-based climate action strategy earlier this month. We will be discussing the strategy with our panel in the first part of our panel discussion. There has always been a focus on the environment in the real estate sector, because of the physical ways that the industry interacts, changes and repurposes land. But with the target of the UK achieving net zero by 2050 being enshrined in UK law, as well as international law and regulation being brought in to require businesses to demonstrate their sustainability credentials, there is more focus from all industries on the environment. This has been reflected in a renewed effort from all industries, including the real estate industry and including their industry bodies, such as the Better Building Partnership's climate change commitment, of which I know several of the CPA members are signatories. Having the targets, commitments, or in the case of the city, a strategy is the first step. But in this webinar, we will be discussing in more detail, how is the real estate sector in London leading the effort to achieve those net zero targets? How are they overcoming challenges? For example, developing a new green building is relatively straightforward when compared to assessing the most sustainable way to retrofit an existing building to improve its sustainability. And how are they responding to the demands of those that use their buildings? To lead those discussions, I have the pleasure of introducing our panel of sustainability experts who are joining us today. Alithia Freire, who is a chartered engineer and director at Twin and Earth, an engineering and sustainability consultancy firm. Alexia Laird, who is Sustainable Design Executive at Land Securities. Derek Wilson, who is the Senior Sustainable Development Manager at Transport for London. And Dan Campbell, who is an architect and director at Stiff and Trevelyan Architects. Before we turn to our panel, I would like to introduce Alistair Moss, the Chair of the Planning and Transportation Committee at the City of London Corporation, and Simi Shah, Project Director for the Climate Action Strategy, who are going to give an overview of the aims of the Climate Action Strategy and how the City plans to implement the strategy. If you have any questions for Alistair and Simi, please put them in the Q&A and I'll put those to Alistair and Simi straight after their presentation. I already have one question ready for the end of the presentation that was submitted before today. Alistair and Simi, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everyone, on behalf of Simi and I. I'm going to speak to you for about 10 minutes or so to introduce our climate action plan and what we're doing as the City Corporation. I assume you all know what the City Corporation does and what we stand for, but in a nutshell, we look after the square mile for the city, and we're a local authority, but with lots of add-ons. We want to make the City of London a leader in climate change, basically, and we believe our climate action strategy is radical, and hopefully what I'll say in the next few minutes will reinforce that. There are some real headlines here, just by way of introduction, that we hope to make the square mile net zero carbon by 2040, which is 10 years earlier than the government goals. We very much feel that we have based our policy on science. We haven't rushed this at all. We're also backing this up with a huge amount of money. We will be investing around £68 million fighting climate change over the next 6 years. And we hope to create around 800 green jobs as a result of this. We also, as you'll hear in a minute, want to reduce our own emissions and also strengthen our planning regulations as to how the city is going to be built. And I know there's already a question on that was just referred to. We have set up a climate action fund as well, which is basically going to see us and large businesses combine resources for low and zero carbon technologies, and also importantly to support SMEs who aren't necessarily as well resourced. Some of you will also know, by way of opening, about our transport strategy, which you would have seen in COVID-19 has accelerated in terms of how we're dealing with the city streets. Those of you who have been into the city in the last few months will notice there's far more space dedicated to walking and to active travel, cycling, etc. And we also are really privileged to be custodian of large open spaces, many parks and other spaces also within the city and outside the city. And our strategy will be covering those points too. So it's a really ambitious plan that we feel we have. And I suppose the basis of it, if you can go on to the next slide, please. After next, please. So what do we stand for as the city? Those three things kind of stand for themselves. Most people associate us with running what we would say is the world's leading financial and business centre, but you'll see there that we don't see that as the whole pillar, so to speak. There is also a societal and environmental aspect to that. Next. So just elaborating on that, the world-class financial centre, which I just alluded to on the left-hand side there, clearly has all of the benefits for London and the UK that come with it in terms of job creation and our efficiencies and all the tax take and things from the city. I think a broad figure is that the city's tax take contributes around 50% of the NHS's costs, for example, per year. But then as part of that, we take our responsibility towards the environment and people very seriously. The city doesn't operate in a vacuum, and we're really clear about that. So obviously, as part of the environment, we need to attract people into working in the environment who could really choose to work anywhere in the world. And therefore, things like air quality and open space and the whole enjoyment of that, as well as resilience, is really, really important. So you'll see that in our outstanding environments part. And then in terms of how people interact with the city, we have a very diverse group of people who work in the city. The majority of people are in their 20s and 30s, this kind of group. And say across the world, we also have and look after many deprived areas of London where the economy of the city helps that as well. Next, please. So where do we see the risk and opportunity? It's obvious, although not spoken about very much, that there are physical risks to the city, which I'll come to in a minute. It is a piece of land which is next to water and is located on our planet with lots of challenges that kind of go with that. And I think there are also perception issues of the city, which kind of tie in with the reputational, and also what makes it good is driven partly by commercial concerns, which we know kind of becomes a cycle. We know that more and more businesses and people are attracted to the city for all the other reasons, particularly environmental ones that I alluded to. And what can we do with this? Where can we maximize and leverage this? The resilience, certainly. We can be more efficient. It's long been a bugbear of mine, for example, in terms of deliveries to and from the city are random at the moment and inefficient from an environmental and an economic perspective. How can we deal with that? How can we operate with that advantage that other cities in the world don't have? I think we've got a great lead over most cities, but we are not complacent at all. And also that societal piece, again, the city it's got to really put people at its heart. Without the people in the city doesn't really mean very much. Next, please. So the headlines. Net zero, as I said, certain dates I'll come on to in a minute. Our climate resilience, so not taking anything for granted and preserving and enhancing the environment we have. And then how do we grow and making that sustainable in its broadest sense. Next. So we want within our own operations net zero. We think this is a very challenging target to be net zero by 2027 in our own operations, and then 2040 across our whole value chain. I think the most exciting figure in here, though, is the net zero by 2040 in the square mile itself, which, as I said before, is a very ambitious target, well ahead of government deadlines, and one which we take seriously in terms of that competitiveness and our responsibility. And also, importantly, building this resilience in everything we do in terms of flooding, heat, etc. And over the last few years, it's fair to say that we've really built upon our knowledge of how the city operates and what the environmental metrics are of the city. And we're just going to build upon that to make it resilient to those things which we know are outside of our control. Next slide, please. So yeah, how are we going to do this? I alluded to the £68 million that we'll be spending over 5 years on this, which is a large amount of money for a local authority to be investing, but one which I should say has huge member and political support across our elected representatives for very good reason. So energy efficiency models, investing in our portfolio. We're privileged to have a several £billion investment portfolio and also an operational portfolio, many iconic buildings and other spaces. Our open spaces, places like Epping Forest and parks, that we're responsible for running, as well as micro spaces within the city itself. Protecting natural resources and the net zero in our supply chain. As I said, we are, I'm not sure of the figures, maybe Simi can cover these, but we're certainly a major procurer of services with a large turnover budget each year. And 6, which I think is more important, that everything we do is basically making this as a reference point, has a continuous reference point to it. And just by way of example, I've just chaired the city's Planning Transportation Committee for about 4 hours or so, and policies there, we're dealing with COVID, there are environmental issues coming up on those, even though members aren't prompted by them. So this is starting to pervade their thought as to how we govern the city. Next slide, please. How are we going to do it? We feel really passionately that we don't do this alone, to state the obvious, and we will do it with everyone. We think we're quite good at consulting, which always means that we should try harder, in my view, in local government to government. So we will be doing that. The SMEs, the vast majority of businesses in the city are SMEs, of course, and we recognise that through that fund, that larger business and ourselves need to assist there. This isn't an easy win for many businesses. And finally, this extreme weather point. I can remember many years ago speaking about flooding in London, and it's we forget that the Thames has breached before, that if a city gets too hot, that it's just not an appealing place to be. And these are all kind of factors that are as important as the air quality, road safety, etc., things like that. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, I think, in terms of why we think this is an exemplar and why we're really proud of this work. I call out Simi in terms of her work here, and there's been a really, really great effort on the part of officers and lead members in the City Corporation to give this traction over the last year or so to come to this point now. We think we've taken we know we've taken a scientific approach to this, and we were, I think, criticised at first for not, like many local authorities, declaring a climate emergency, but we've been slow and deliberate in terms of building the case up, being scientific in it, and assessing those risks and working out what we can change and what we can't change. And that has involved working out how other people are doing things and what we can do ourselves. And it involves also the whole chain across the city. Clearly, there's millions of moving parts in the city, some of which we're directly responsible for, some of which we can influence. But we are the local authority, so we feel, our strategy, we are there to make this strategy. And finally, I think excitingly, we are looking at carbon sequestration in terms of using our open spaces to accelerate CO2 removal. Say we are custodians of large open space, so that will be something we're specifically looking at. Hopefully that gives you all a flavour as to where we're going to and the hard work that Simi and others have been putting into this. And I think we're happy to take questions.
Thanks, Alistair. That was really interesting just to get that overview. And I think people forget that the huge amount of land that the city does own, and how that can be potentially used as a carbon sink and to hold that key resources of carbon that are stored in places like Epping Forest with all those trees. So it's good to think both urban and also the more countryside and rural coming together as part of that strategy. As I mentioned, I did have one question to put to you and to Simi. So this comes from Dan Higginson of Greycoat, and he has asked, how will the city's planning department support the strategy? Dan mentioned in follow-up to his question that he understands the need to preserve the aesthetic quality and architectural integrity of the city, but he feels that the definition of acceptable needs to change to better accommodate sustainable measures for new developments.
Great. Shall I do the political answer, Simi, and then you can follow up with the factual one? That is a great question, as someone's just said there. I think we are, those of you who observe our deliberations at the planning committee and are looking at the local plan that's emerging, it's fair to say we've now got a presumption against the redevelopment of buildings, which is a real step from where I'd imagine we would have been 5 years ago or so. To elaborate on what that means, we will look for very reasoned justification to drop any building and rebuild. We will start from the basis that what is existing stock can be dealt with and is more sustainable. So that will kind of come out in our local plan. It's obvious to me that part of what the city, it makes it so special is all these heritage assets that we have. Realistically, we are, quote, stuck with those, and I think that's probably a real strength of the city, and they kind of are what they are. They're buildings that have stood the test of time. But going forward, we will not be accepting buildings which have like a 25 or 40 or 60-year lifespan to them. We will be expecting applicants to come to us saying why a building is not fit for purpose in line with the strategy, or if it is, why it is. So, we're looking for far more of that kind of thought, and say that is mainstream thought across the committee. Simi, do you want to add to that?
I think there's a larger point thinking about the strategy is that it's been developed in a cross-corporation team. So the planning department has been involved in the development of the strategy, and they'll be involved in the execution. I know sometimes there's one area that's pushing the strategy. That's really not true here. It's been a very much a cross-corporation effort. And so, as Alistair said, it'll be aligned with local plan and future local plans. And we have a specific work group around integration of our decisions around climate. So this won't be something that's happening in one small area. On the competing tensions point, one of the things I think we're going to be trying to identify pretty quick is some demonstration projects about buildings that have done really unique things. And not only the heritage site, but I think there's a really interesting question around 60s, 50s buildings, of which we hold and members will hold as well. So we'd like to really identify one or two of those projects up front, and if anybody has any ideas, we'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. We do have a couple of other questions. There was a question about somebody who's a resident in the city, and they just wanted to hear whether there were any particular plans around implementing the strategy for residents in the city.
Yes, so it's a really important question. There's both a commercial and a residential aspect to the buildings plan. And now that we have the policy mandate, it was just adopted earlier this month, actually, we will be mobilizing. So I don't have building level specific plans, but we'll be looking at our residential estate and issues for residents going forward it's not a blank slate. We've done some work thinking about which residential buildings we could intervene on and get the most sort of carbon bang for buck, if you find a glib phrase. So we're just identifying those now, and we're also going out to speak. There'll be an engagement program for residents to go and speak to them about their ideas and concerns. Some of that has started, and it will ramp up in earnest next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. There was an additional question just on, so obviously it's very important that these types of strategies and plans put in place by, corporations like the City Corporation, back it with funding. As Alistair mentioned, 68 million has been assigned. A question has come in from Peter Boville of Montague Evans to say, is there any more detail on how that money is going to be spent, and spending it on properties or pump priming to leverage more expenditure, presumably on, getting more funding in to help the strategy?
Yes. So the 68 million is new money in the next 6 years. It's actually not our total spend on environmental interventions, but it's new money that's been decided and issued in respect to the strategy. Around 15 million pounds of that is for resilience, and the remainder is for net zero or energy interventions. 15 million pounds of resilience is divided between interventions in individual buildings and in this public realm. The remainder is in the public realm. What we want to do with that money is do a series of pilots based on some of the environmental metrics that Alistair referenced. What we already know is sort of risk points for the city. You may know the city's an island. We need to start looking now at changing the planting, for instance, in the public realm. We're going to do a series of pilots over the next 6 years to inform a longer-term program. We need to make quite serious interventions by about 2030. So we feel that that gives us enough time to ramp that up. On the net zero side, about 35 million pounds of that is into our buildings, both on the investment and operational side. There's another 2 million pounds going into changing the way that we manage the soil in our open spaces. And this will mostly start in Epping Forest and then roll out into the other spaces from there. I can give more details on the budget if there's other issues, but you were probably interested in the buildings amount.
Yeah, thank you, Simi. That was really great just to get that breakdown. I think finally, just the last question, because we'll move on to the panel, but a question has come in just on whether in putting together strategy, it was taken into account the embodied and operational energy in line with the World Green Building Council and the UK Green Building Council, and then REBA's climate challenge targets. And that was from Jonathan Spratt at Bennett's Associates Architects.
Yes, so this is a huge focus for us going forward, is that we are not at present fully accounted for life embodiment, sort of life cycle costing. And a portion of this investment will go into building that through all of our systems going forward. So it is definitely an area that we can improve on, and we're really committed to. Alistair, could you comment on the REBA question?
Yeah, I can't answer that in detail, but this was what I was trying to allude to earlier in terms of how we will look at the embodied energy in terms of the options for development, which I think is what Jonathan's question is alluding to. So yeah, we will say, maybe I wasn't very eloquent earlier, but that is what we're moving to. Whether it's the World Green Building Council and REBA climate change challenge targets, I don't know. But I'm assuming if they're best practice, we will be looking at those. And as Simi said, she is working very closely with planning policy colleagues, and we've got the advantage that the local plan is at a stage now where we can basically reconsult on that, and we've got some time now to kind of look at that and feed these things into it. The other thing I'd just say that Peter will be aware of is in terms of the planning context here, in terms of Section 106 and community infrastructure levy money and things, that in terms of the sources of funding, the planning white paper at the moment does kind of throw that up in the air a bit as to where we're going to get money from, bluntly, and how that will be. So, there is that kind of threat there, and I would encourage anyone on this call, I'm sure many of you have already, but to look at that white paper on planning and see what you think, especially from this perspective on it, as to whether there are good or bad points in it. But I'd say that's one particular risk point on it, that it's I think going to be harder to append monies to certain things from it.
Thank you very much for those answers to those questions. We are going to now move on to the panel discussion. And just a very quick reminder that if you have any questions for the panel, please again put them in the Q&A and I'll try to address them at the end. So the first part of the panel discussion is just on the actual climate action strategy and the panelists' response to that. So Alithia, what opportunities will championing sustainable growth in the City of London create? If you could just talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, from kind of my point of view, and remembering that I work on buildings themselves, I think that the point that Alistair has just made on the presumption of retention and retaining the buildings and basically reusing them, which I completely agree is the right approach, I think it's going to present a really good opportunity to raise the bar on the performance of refurbished developments. So historically, the kind of planning requirements for refurbishment has been a bit of a kind of a grey area, and from my point of view, have been sometimes not onerous enough. The new London plan acknowledges that and kind of changes the baseline, but still, I think that obviously there are constraints within the energy performance of an existing building and things that we cannot change, like thermal bridging and other things. But there are a lot of improvements that can be made to bring them relatively close to the performance of a new development. So I think that it's going to be very interesting to see whether through implementing this strategy in line with the planning mechanism, we will see kind of a new generation of sustainable refurbishments within the city.
Thank you for that. To Alexia, how can business support the City Corporation in achieving their net zero goals?
Yeah, I think I think beyond supporting, I think businesses will need to play a fundamental part in achieving these targets, because at the end of the day, a lot of the scopes 1 and 2 emissions of the square miles targets are made up of business emissions. So we need to play a fundamental part in tackling this. And I think we therefore need to, I think there's 3 main things that we need to be doing. And the first thing would be to set our own targets in accordance with science that either align with or exceed the timescales that we're working with the City Corporation. And I think that's really instrumental in laying out the groundworks and setting up that trajectory, and also making sure that we're staying on track to achieving those targets. And especially, we're talking about small and medium enterprises. I think we need to be helping those companies in setting their own targets to bring them up and join the challenge. I think the second thing that we as businesses need to do is really start, we've got a very loud voice, and I think we need to use that voice to place demands on the supply chain. And I think we really need to start asking the questions around, embodied carbon, which we've spoken about a little bit, and around environmental product declarations and the healthy materials content. We need to use our voice to ask the awkward questions and get them geared up to the challenges that they will inevitably face. And I think the earlier we ask the questions, the quicker we can shift the supply chain into action to start meeting these targets. And I think finally, I work for Landsec. I think for me, the last point is we have the responsibility as a real estate business to be a good, responsible landlord. When we look at the existing building stock around, I think it's estimated that around 75% of buildings in 2050 have already been built. So going back to your initial point, Charlotte, about what are we going to be doing about the existing stock? There's a massive amount of work that we need to do, and that we as businesses need to be investing in, or as a real estate business, we need to be investing in our own stock and our own assets, again, to make sure that we're all moving towards that common goal, because we're not going to do it in isolation. It's going to have to come from both.
Thank you for that. Derek, if I could just ask you, how can the City Corporation and other public sector services help businesses achieve their net zero targets and other climate goals?
It's a really big challenge. There's no question. There's a lot of different ways that the public sector can impact the private sector. So I think the first element is really through the supply chain. it's not so much about supporting in certain cases as it is instructing and just being clear as a public sector what you want as a client. Our supply chains are quite happy to deliver better performance. They're happy to deliver in line with our zero carbon targets, but quite often we're very bad at saying that up front and just really requesting specifications that kind of align with our longer term ambitions. We tend to go out, procure quickly and try and deal with these issues later. And of course, that undermines the cause. So if you're looking at it in the context of supply chains, I think it's really just about being crystal clear up front as to what you want. And then making those supply chains actually available to other businesses, because the public sector has huge procurement power. And unlike most individual companies, it's able to really kind of get the best out of the industry. So for example, if it says, we want a materials palette for this major refurbishment project across our estate that has a certain embodied carbon target met, you can get suppliers to respond in that way, and then you can make that same kind of package accessible to other parties. We, for instance, have come up with a number of procurement frameworks that can be accessed by other local authorities. And similarly, you can do that and open that up to the public or to the private sector. So I think that using that procurement power, using that supply chain, and then sharing access to the benefits that can generate with the private sector is probably the best way to really kind of drive that change.
Thank you. I don't think we always think about supply chains, particularly if we're in private businesses. So it's a really good point to think about more broadly. And then to Dan, if I could just ask you, what will be the biggest challenge for the City Corporation in becoming net zero carbon by 2040?
Well, I think it's a very ambitious target. Not only is it 10 years shorter than that set out in the UK Climate Change Act, but I think what's applaudable by the city is that they're taking a very holistic view on it. So not just looking at what they can control, but these Scope 3 emissions as well, which extend to everything that they buy, sell, invest, lease or dispose of. And that's going to mean that they've got to engage very closely in partnerships with stakeholders, providers, investors, occupiers, and their neighbours, frankly. And the city itself has a unique set of kind of functional, physical, and compositional constraints, I think. So it has a finite area, and it's got significantly improved urban greening now, and as we've heard, the city controls, I think it's 11,000 acres of green space in London and within its green belt, which is I saw a statistic that is 5,500 football pitches, to give you a kind of comparative, and but that is actually still quite a small area compared with the dense urban buildup of the square mile. And if we're talking about sequestering and offsetting carbon, then there's a limited area to do that within, which hence goes back to my point about partnering with neighbours as well, when I mean on the kind of UK scale and global scale. The density of the city is pretty unique to the UK. It supports 1 in 58 UK workers, or 10% of the London workforce. So it's significant. And within that, there's 24,000 businesses. But as was touched on earlier, nearly 99% of those are SMEs. So that's an enormous amount of stakeholders that you're dealing with that somehow have to be brought along with that journey in order to meet these targets. And that's a huge undertaking and very ambitious, I think. And then on top of that, there are obstacles which are not unique to the city that we share with other global urban centres. Most relevant one at the moment perhaps is levels of post-COVID investment and what's going to happen. It's all well and good talking about refurbishing these buildings and so on, but who's going to come in and spend that money? And then, as Alistair touched on very importantly, is that this is all set against an ever-changing set of environmental criteria. You know, we've got to prepare ourselves for hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, more extreme weather events. So whilst I think there's a lot of challenges there, I must say that, you know, given the importance of the city, and you only need to look at the percentage of the UK tax revenue that it generates, as Alistair mentioned, versus the NHS, it's important that the city does grasp this challenge, because it's only through that will it cement its position as a kind of global lead on this and make it the type of centre that people will want to invest in, and therefore it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We will now be turning over to the second part of our panel discussion, which is exploring individual and business initiatives. I'd like to start with Derek on these questions, and there's a bit of a two-part for Derek. So the first part is, can you give a brief overview of the wider influence that Transport for London has on decarbonisation?
Yes, that's it's a pretty complex one, of course, because TfL is one of the largest landowners in London. We own about 5,700 acres of land in within Greater London. So you know, massive landholder. And across that estate, we've got vast operational properties, as you can imagine. We've also got over 2,000 commercial properties. That's retail, office, light industrial. We've got 17 head office buildings, and we've also got a multi-billion-pound development pipeline. So within our own business initiatives, just on the property side, we've actually got a lot of work to do. You know, this massive stock of existing industrial, retail, office property, very challenging to retrofit and kind of get to grips with. We've also got this property development portfolio, which you know, is quite vast, and I can touch on that a bit later in more detail if we'd like. But so you've got the kind of more direct element of the kind of net zero equation, but you've also got the less direct, but in fact a lot more material contribution, which is our role in the transport network. A vast amount of our carbon emissions come from transport. And you know, as London's transport provider, you know, we have a very outsized impact on the carbon emissions associated with transport to and from buildings. And in the case of the City of London, where you have a lot of workers kind of coming in and out, that ends up proving really quite key, because when you start talking about, you know, like Scope 3 emissions, people traveling to and from the city, suddenly if we're shifting towards car use, for instance, rather than using more sustainable modes of travel, that becomes very problematic from a carbon emissions point of view. So, you know, I think that, you know, the work that we've been doing in partnership with the City of London, indeed what the City of London has been doing, you know, kind of their own volition when it comes to promoting walking and cycling and active travel and sustainable transport, is having a huge impact. And the density point that was touched on earlier, I think, is actually also quite key, because not a lot of people realize, but if you end up building even like a carbon neutral building out in kind of a sprawl scenario out in the suburbs, where people have to drive to and from, you end up emitting more than if you're building, you know, a kind of a standard Part L compliant building in a dense area where people don't have to transport at all. You know, so the transport emissions can be very significant. It's not just about the emissions of a building, and you know, we can have a much bigger impact on emissions more globally, in the sense that we are, you know, developing and delivering real estate around transit nodes. So that, I think, is probably the wider picture.
Thank you for that. Just very briefly, as we're trying to keep to time, would you just be able to touch on, you know, specifically examples of how, as you say, you've got a huge property portfolio, how the Transport for London are, you know, trying to keep to their sustainability targets, if you have any specific examples you have to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got we've basically got to take a slightly multifaceted strategy, because, you know, as has been mentioned previously, the nature of the beast when you're talking about getting to net zero on new developments versus retrofits is a completely different game. And, you know, obviously embodied carbon kind of factors into that as well. So how do you make best use of your existing assets? But, you know, I think that in that regard, we've got kind of two strategies. One is on the new build. So there, what we're pushing for is very low embodied carbon. So really efficient use of materials and using low carbon materials with EPDs, for instance. Excuse me. And then really pushing to achieve kind of benchmark levels of energy efficiency and combining that with very low carbon energy systems. So for example, setting energy use intensity targets in line with the LEDI climate design guide, for example, and pairing that up with an all electric heating system. So looking at, you know, air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps or ambient loops, that sort of thing. So, you know, sustainable energy systems, high energy efficiency and low embodied carbon. That's kind of our roadmap there. On the retrofit side, I think like many kind of property owners across the sector, we're still getting to grips with it. We obviously need to make best use of our existing stock. We can't afford to just knock everything down and build everything up just only for the embodied carbon. How we begin to retrofit a arch that's 150 years old and make it carbon neutral is an outstanding question. I can't say we have the answer yet. But you know, it's something that we're definitely trying to work our way through, and we'll be looking to collaborate with the public sector and the private sector to figure that out.
Okay, thank you for that, Derek. Alexia, so we know that Landsec has a very ambitious target to be net zero by 2030. Could you just give an explanation on maybe a couple examples of how you're going to achieve that? And, you know, why is this so important for Landsec? That's a very ambitious target to set.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, you're right. We have at Landsec, we've had a long-standing commitment to climate change mitigation and carbon reduction. And we were actually the first property company in the world to set science-based targets back in 2016, I believe it was. And I mean, to get there, I'm going to be honest, you know, we haven't got it all figured out. There's some areas where, I mean, especially as Derek mentioned, you know, the existing stock is kind of the big elephant in the room, which we're still grappling with and trying to figure out. But the way that we've set out the trajectory to meeting these ambitions is through a 5-step plan. And basically, the first step is really looking at operational energy, because at the end of the day, most of our carbon comes from running our buildings. So alongside the absolute carbon reduction emissions targets that we've got from the science-based targets, we also are just looking at reducing the energy intensity of our existing assets. And one of the ways that we're trying to kind of spur enthusiasm or kind of responsibility in this is that we've got a corporate energy reduction target. And that's linked to executive remuneration. So it really filters down into everyone's day-to-day business, because it's in their interest to basically get it sorted, because at the end of the day, it's completely linked to how much they'll get paid out at the end of the day. So, you know, it's really instilling that sense of responsibility beyond just the sustainability team and giving that ownership throughout. And I mean, again, when we look at future buildings, it is a lot easier, but we're kind of banking on pushing the efficiency of our future buildings to try and uplift the average of the portfolio, because, you know, we do have some older assets which are just a lot harder to grapple with. So we're a long-term owner of our assets, and so we work with the Design for Performance initiative to look at the energy use intensity and look at the benchmarks. So the UK GBC's Paris benchmarks, and we use those to influence the design of our buildings. So that's really the first step, which is probably the biggest one, because it has quite a big impact. But the second step is really looking at investing in renewable energy. So we, as a company, have been purchasing only 100% REGO-backed electricity since 2016, and we'll be looking to move to power purchase agreements by 2030. But we've also got a commitment to deliver 3 megawatts of renewable electricity production on site. And we're doing this, you know, through the installation of PV arrays, not so much in our London portfolio, but more in the retail parks where we've got, you know, a bigger roof area available for those. Then we look at the third step, which is using an internal shadow price of carbon. And I think it's been really, really key in factoring or helping to make carbon more apparent in key decisions. So we apply this £80 per tonne is what we've calculated it to be. Per tonne of CO2, and we apply it on any decisions around investment opportunities, but also when assessing development options. So for example, we've got an asset that's in need of some kind of intervention. We use the shadow price of carbon to look at what embodied carbon would be would it cost to refit it, what embodied carbon would it cost to reposition it, so, you know, building in and around it, extending it, or completely demolishing it and rebuilding it. And that way it's really bringing to life that carbon that to date hasn't been at the forefront of decision making. Our fourth step, and I won't spend too long on this because we've spoken about it a lot, but it's about embodied carbon. Because at the end of the day, the more efficient our buildings get, the higher the proportion of the whole life carbon falls in the embodied carbon. So we're really working hard to make sure that we're minimizing that. Again, prioritizing the reuse of structures and elements wherever possible, then looking at efficient design, you know, not overcomplicating things, bringing it back down to the basics, and, you know, repeated structures, and just avoiding any of that, the waste that we tend to go down. And then again, specifications, looking at high recycled content and low carbon materials. And then the fifth step of the way is, you know, at the end of the day, our business is about building and managing buildings, and we are always going to need some kind of materials to go onto site. So there will always be a certain proportion of offset necessary. And so once we've minimized the embodied carbon as far as possible, we then work with a carbon offset provider to make sure that those are offset. So that's the plan that we've laid ourselves to achieve our ambitions by 2030. And I suppose the second part of the question was about why is it important? So I mean, there's one part which is quite obvious, which is just about future-proofing the business and maintaining relevance. And, you know, we're seeing that investors are increasingly interested in this. But I think for us, we're actually seeing a new angle to this, where it's becoming a new way for us to talk to our customers, because you know, we see new climate commitments or carbon reduction commitments from companies on a daily basis. And we as landlords have a unique opportunity to help them on that journey by providing them with low carbon office space. And there was a recent report from JLL that actually showed that there's about 8 million square feet of office space in London that's coming up to some kind of lease renewal. They're currently occupied with by companies with science-based targets. So the likelihood is that at some point, those companies will be looking to occupy low carbon office space, because that's a low hanging fruit to help towards their own ambitions. So we, again, see a business opportunity in that we can really help with them. But I think what's really important here is that we absolutely cannot do this on our own as landlords. We need to collaborate more with our tenants, because we can only take the building so far from a landlord perspective, but a tenant can come in and fit it out with some inefficient kit, run it a stupid amount of hours per week, and that can completely essentially just overshoot our commitment. So we really need to be thinking about new ways of engaging with our tenants in clever ways to make sure that we work collaboratively towards our common efforts. Okay. I think that's why we're seeing the importance.
Thank you very much for that, Alexia. And that discussion about the interplay between landlord and tenant brings me nicely on to Alethea. Because there were 2 points we wanted to pick up with you, both that Alexia actually just touched on. So firstly, we know that Twin and Earth is a delivery partner for the Better Building Partnerships Design for Performance initiative. So we'd like to hear just a bit about that initiative and what the aims are. And then, you know, very much on this point about, you know, liaising with occupiers and tenants. You know, what do you think the key trends are that, you know, occupiers and tenants and policymakers might demand in the future, particularly as so much space is likely to come up in the next few years, as Alexia mentioned?
Sure. So design for performance is fundamentally an energy kind of rating system. It's a way of measuring the energy performance of buildings. So as you say, it's not that it has been kind of developed by Better Buildings Partnership, but it has been, let's say, brought to the UK by them. This is based on an Australia scheme called Neighbours, which now kind of links with Australian policy, and that has basically managed to deliver a complete change in terms of operational carbon emissions of buildings, and it has significantly reduced the operational carbon emissions. I think that the key thing, when you talk about energy rating, you know, we probably all think about energy performance certificates and other things that we already have to measure the energy performance of buildings. The difference with this is that this focuses on in-use performance. So the aim is not to estimate what the predicted carbon emissions of the building are going to be, but to actually design so that you achieve in real life, while the building is occupied, that targeted performance. And that is particularly important is in the UK, because in the previous years we've been designing buildings following kind of Part-L methodology, EPC methodology, and basically what we have found is that there is a big gap between the estimated carbon performance of buildings as we model it during the design and during the construction, and the actual energy performance. And there are a number of reasons why that happens. So one of them is the modeling assumptions and the modeling methodology. So Part-L and kind of EPCs follow a standardized methodology that makes a number of assumptions. So it does not really allow you kind of to tailor it to the actual building. There is also, of course, differences between the way we assume buildings are going to be operated and the way that buildings are actually operated. So what's kind of design for performance does is like it kind of, I think it addresses each of these issues. So on the kind of modeling front, what it does is like we'll be using more advanced ways of modeling buildings. The tool exists. It's just moving away from national calculation methodologies and basically creating what you will call a digital twin of the building. So create something that is as similar to your building as possible so that you can actually properly predict what's going to happen. But apart from the technical side of it, what it does is that it kind of integrates the targets within the supply chain. So the entire team is going to set an in-use target, and everyone is going to commit to deliver that target when the building is in use. And the building is actually not going to achieve the rating and certificate until it's in operation. It actually achieves the consumption, which is very interesting because I think it changes everyone's mindset. And also I think it puts a bit of, well, it highlights as well the need for kind of fine-tuning of buildings. So it's not that we design them, we build them, commission them, maybe do seasonal commissioning. No, it's not just like that. When you kind of commission a building, it starts running, it very likely is not going to perform like you expected, and you need to go back and do fine-tuning and really investigate, you know, how you can improve that to get to that level of performance that kind of you need to achieve. In terms of implementation, as you said earlier, we are kind of delivery partners, and there have been also kind of 11 developers that have put their hands up. Landsec, as Alexia mentioned, the Crown State, there were a few others. We are the energy consultants on one of those projects, which is for Grosvenor. It's South Maldon Triangle, and it's a kind of a mixed scheme in central London. And we all need to learn throughout this process. This has been going on in Australia for a number of years, as I said, and I think they went through a big kind of learning curve, and we were kind of chatting with the Better Business Partnership, and they were explaining, you know, at the beginning how at the beginning it was very challenging. They were not achieving what they were expecting. So it's going to be a big learning curve for everyone, I think. And the last thing to say is that at the moment we are focusing on achieving the rating for kind of the base build, so for the landlord. But then the kind of tenants will also be able to follow the same methodology. That's a kind of a sort of a summary, but actually yesterday an email was kind of sent around because there's a date for the official launch of Neighbours UK, and that's going to be the 26th of December. So if you go online and you look for Better Buildings Partnership, you probably can kind of join the webinar. You know, I can send you the link, and it will be very, very interesting. And with the second question, which was kind of the relationship between landlords and tenants, I think that as we try to reduce the energy intensity of buildings, and this is actually a debate that I had also as part of the BCO Technical Affairs Committee that I sit on, in the BCO guide and all of that. So as we try to reduce the energy intensity of buildings, whether you want to follow, you know, the kind of LETI guidance or whatever you want to achieve, we are talking about reducing the energy consumption significantly from what we have now. So that means that perhaps we can no longer develop buildings that can be that can fit any tenant consumption. You know, you need to design to specific lighting levels. Your tenant is going to have to be prepared to accept that. They need to be prepared to accept a limit on their cooling load and that type of thing. So it really more than ever requires that there is a collaboration and kind of early engagement, and that there is a common target to make these buildings perform in practice.
That's great. Thank you, Alithia. And finally, Dan, we wanted to really bring you into the conversation in respect to historic buildings and the opportunities in respect to redevelopment. And you know, what can we do with existing building stock to ensure that they too can perform well in respect to sustainability? And do you have any examples of projects that you've worked on that reflect this?
Yes, well, it's an interesting one, because I think it doesn't sound like during the discussions today that people hold this common misconception now, but historically I think people assume that existing buildings were inherently less sustainable than new build buildings. I guess that's an overgeneralization based on kind of perceptions of thermal efficiency and drafty, poorly performing buildings. But that's kind of also, I suggest, perpetuated a little bit by our current accreditation system. And Alicia is talking about different accreditation there, which is music to my ears, because I don't think, you know, when you look at EPC certificates and BREEAM, it's very difficult for refurbished buildings as they stand to compare against a new build building. But that's, as we know, not the full picture of the situation. And I think this is where, you know, it's been discussed in the Q&A and so on, but this whole life carbon assessment is really important. And as Alexia suggested, you know, now that M&E systems are becoming increasingly efficient, and we're getting rid of on-site combustion, and we're delivering decarbonised electricity. Actually, what we're finding is that the embodied carbon is a far more significant impact than the operational carbon over a whole life cycle assessment. And I think this is kind of backed up also by some of the statistics. You know, the UK construction industry accounts for 60% of material use and creates a third of all waste, which is an enormous number. And it generates 40% of all energy related CO2. So if we were to maintain the current trajectory, we're looking at tripling material extraction in 30 years and waste production by 2100. So it's an enormous thing. And I think we're beyond now, you know, solar panels and bolt-on gadgets. Whilst they've got some merits to them, that's not the kind of world of sustainability as it once was. And I think we've got to have a fundamental shift in our consideration of materials and think of existing buildings as kind of material depots in a way, in which we should be looking to see how we can maximize their use and not just waste them. And so that kind of leads to, I think, what Alistair was talking about earlier, this presumption of reuse. And I have to say, before I go into that, I don't think it's the only solution, but it should be the starting point, that we have to discuss that and analyse very carefully whether actually that's the right course of action in the most sustainable approach or not. And of course, sustainability is multifaceted. You can't just think about a whole life carbon assessment. There's more to it than that. But as an example, our practice, I totted up before I came onto this. I think in the last 4 years, we've either delivered or are currently in the process of delivering nearly 1 million square feet of refurbished office space in the city alone. And that is a common trend, I guess, across a lot of the central London boroughs that we're working in. So I think the market is already going that way, and we're finding more and more that planning departments are, one of the first questions to us is actually, well, why justify the demolition of this building in the first place? And I mean, there'll be developers probably on listening to this. They'll tell us, you know, how they stack up commercially, but we're not finding that there's a massive disconnect when it's put out to the market between a new build building and a well-crafted refurbished building. And you know, as signatories to the Architects Declare Climate Emergency and Biodiversity Emergency, that's become our ethos, that we should adopt a more regenerative design principles, where we look at upgrading buildings for extended use where appropriate and minimize waste, really. And so one example that we've currently got on site at the moment, just to put some of this into numbers, is we've got a building, it's about 200,000 square feet, and it's not an insignificant redevelopment. We're extending it, we're coring the building, so there's quite a lot of intervention, but facades have been retained. They're historic facades, so it's important. You know, you're working around the compromises of the existing building, but in turn adds character and interest. And we actually find sometimes that attracts tenants rather than, you know, becomes a feature that they're concerned about. As Alicia was talking about, what we now have the benefit is a lot of computer technology, where you can create a digital twin. So we've been modeling these buildings. So you can actually really get into the detail of analysing and quantifying the amount of carbon that you're retaining. And in that case, what we found is that when we looked at taking the existing building, what we were removing and what we were putting back in kind of, that we were retaining 90% of the building. And that equates to 10,500 tonnes of embodied carbon, which is 11,500 return trips to New York, to give you a kind of a comparative. And so what we did is, because again, you know, there aren't you can't just display a BREEAM certificate or an EPC certificate that looks better than the equivalent new build down the road. So we started to try and find other ways of explaining that story. And what we found, I mean, to go back to my football pitch analogy that I talked about before with the city, is that to sequester the amount of carbon we were retaining in the structure of that building, it would take the size of 125 football pitches. In a life cycle of a tree is 28 years. So you'd have to grow 125 football pitches worth of trees over 28 years to sequester the amount of carbon that was being retained in that one building. And that's circa 2% of the area we were talking about, or just over 2% of the area we're talking about, that the corporation manage in terms of green open space. So that's just in one building. So that's a huge amount, and which is why the embodied carbon needs to be taken so seriously. And I think someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Jonathan from Bennett's, about the REBA targets. So to put that into context, they're very ambitious. And by 2030, the target is to bring buildings down in terms of construction and everything. They come down to 500 kilograms of embodied carbon per meter squared. Currently, the presumption is that most new build commercial buildings are around 1,100. So it's just over half of it. Well, if you take that example I just gave you, in the structure alone, so this isn't adding in all the extra bits on top of that, but that was coming out in net terms at about 57 kilograms. So you can start to see the huge impact having retained that structure has. But, you know, I think it's right that we have the presumption of retention. However, you know, sustainability is a bit more than that. And sometimes there are buildings that unfortunately just, they don't make the most use of their site, or they are so compromised in terms of structure and composition that there are too many drawbacks to them. But then yet there's still interesting things you can do. A lot of carbon in any building is in the ground. So reusing substructure and things like that, even if you're raising the upper superstructure down to the ground, that isn't to mean there aren't other things that you can do to try and retain some of the embodied carbon and materials in schemes.
Thank you. That was just having all that detail, I think really helps both kind of give hope in terms of what can be achieved, but also, you know, just looking at the extent that the technical and the data that needs to be sort of processed just to really achieve what we're all trying to achieve on this call, and what so many businesses are now trying to achieve generally. So it highlights the challenge. I'm afraid we have run over slightly, and so we won't have time for the Q&A, but we are going to sort of collate the questions and hopefully put out a blog post in response to those. Just before we end today's session, I would just like to say thank you to Alistair and Simi and our amazing panel for contributing to this webinar, and to Joe Booth at the CPA and my fellow NextGen committee member, Liam Lawson-Jones, for their assistance with organising this webinar and putting together our panel. I hope you have a good rest of the week, and thanks for joining today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.